Just after 1 a.m. on Bluebonnet Drive in Cocoa, Florida, a woman stepped outside with her small dog on what should have been an ordinary night. The street was quiet, the houses were dark. Nothing about the scene suggested that within minutes, the road would become the site of a fatal attack. Jodi Cowan was close to home, doing something routine in a neighborhood she knew. Her partner, Donald Smith, had just gotten back and believed she was nearby. Then, somewhere down the street, he heard her calling for help. When he ran toward the sound, he stepped into a scene he would never forget. Smith later said he saw two dogs dragging Jodi down the road and into the grass near a truck. The dogs were Pitbulls named Max and Mako. 1 second, the night was still. The next, a quiet residential street had turned into chaos. He rushed in and tried to pull the dogs off her. He called 911. He stayed with her as emergency crews responded. Jodi Cowan was airlifted to Holmes Regional Medical Center, but she died about 2 hours later from the injuries she suffered. That alone would have made the case horrifying. But what made it even more disturbing was what authorities uncovered after she died. Because the deeper investigators looked, the less this resembled a sudden, impossible-to-predict attack. Records, complaints, neighbor accounts, and prior enforcement actions pointed to a much darker possibility. This was a danger people had seen coming long before Jodi Cowan was killed. Jodi Cowan was 50 years old and was described as an avid animal lover. She lived with Donald Smith in an RV on Bluebonnet Drive, and by all accounts, she was doing something completely normal that night. She was not in some remote or clearly dangerous place. She was near home, walking her dog on a neighborhood street. That contrast is what gives the case its emotional force. Bluebonnet Drive sits in a residential part of Cocoa in Brevard County along Florida's Space Coast. It is the kind of place where people expect late-night quiet, not violence. Yet as the investigation unfolded, authorities and neighbors described a pattern that made the threat look far less hidden than it first seemed. The dogs involved in the attack belonged to 29-year-old Linda Cutler, who lived nearby. Neighbors said they had seen the dogs roaming before. They had watched them pace along the fence line. Some had grown worried enough to report them well before the fatal attack. That matters, because once a neighborhood has already been raising concerns, a deadly attack stops looking like pure chance. It starts to look like the final break in a chain that had already been under strain. Security footage reportedly captured part of what happened that night. According to local reporting, the video showed the dogs becoming increasingly agitated while pacing a fence line before Jodi appeared with her small dog. Moments later, they went after her. That footage became one of the most important pieces of the story. Not simply because it captured the incident, but because it appeared to show escalation, agitation, focus, movement toward the victim. It suggested there had been a buildup before the attack exploded into violence. Donald Smith's account made the scene even more devastating. He said he found Jodi in the grass with severe injuries and extensive bites. He also said the dogs came back toward them, forcing him to defend her while trying to keep her alive until help arrived. That detail turns the case from a tragic headline into something much harder to absorb. Now it is not just a report. It is a partner hearing someone he loves cry out in the darkness, running toward the sound, and finding that her final minutes are unfolding just down the road from home. First responders did what they could, but the injuries were too severe, and that is where the story widened. The central question was no longer only how the attack happened. It was how many warning signs had already been there, and why they had not stopped it. According to investigators, Linda Cutler admitted she knew the dogs had been escaping from her yard. Authorities also said she acknowledged they had been becoming more aggressive. In a sworn statement cited by investigators, she said she had installed an additional fence, but that it had holes and the dogs often got through. That single point made the case much harder to dismiss as unforeseeable. Once an owner knows dogs are getting out, once aggression is part of the picture, and once containment is clearly failing, the situation no longer looks random. It looks unstable. It looks like something waiting for the wrong moment. The record tied to the property added even more weight to that view. Reports indicated a pattern of animal service calls going back to 2024. Some earlier complaints involved other dogs at the address, but as Max and Mako got older, concern increasingly centered on them. Neighbors said they had contacted animal services multiple times before Jodi Cowan was killed. Some did not hide how afraid they were. One neighbor told local media, "I do not feel safe." That may be one of the most important lines in the entire case, because it captures the mood before the fatal attack, not after it. People were not describing a one-time scare. They were describing an ongoing problem. The fear was already there. The unease had already taken hold, and still the dogs remained in the neighborhood. Sheriff Wayne Ivey later explained why the situation had not already been shut down. He said that under Florida law, even when there is a prior bite that is not classified as severe, animal enforcement officers can be limited to citations and fines. In other words, authorities may be aware of a danger and still lack the power to remove it before the worst happens. That legal reality became one of the most troubling parts of the aftermath, because Linda Cutler had, according to authorities, already been cited. Officials said she had previously pleaded guilty to offenses involving dogs roaming the neighborhood and dogs not being properly vaccinated. Yet, despite those enforcement actions, the animals stayed at the property. There was also a reported prior biting incident involving one of the dogs. But according to the sheriff, the alleged victim did not cooperate with investigators, and that meant the case could not move forward in a way that led to stronger intervention. At the time, that may have seemed like one more unresolved complaint. After Jodi Cowan's death, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like another missed opportunity to act before someone was killed. That is what makes this case so haunting. The attack itself was sudden. The path to it was not. That path was built out of repeated complaints, known escapes, visible warning signs, a fence that did not hold, and a system that, by its own account, could only go so far before tragedy forced the issue. Once the attack was over, grief in the neighborhood quickly turned into outrage. People were no longer just mourning Jodi Cowan. They were asking why the dogs were still there, why repeated complaints had not triggered stronger action, why it took a death for the full danger of the situation to be treated with maximum urgency. Investigators moved quickly after that. They reviewed records, interviewed neighbors, and built a case against Linda Cutler. According to authorities, the evidence showed she knew the dogs were escaping, knew aggression had become part of the problem, and took only limited action to contain them. Then the case took another turn. 8 days after Jodi Cowan died, deputies found Linda Cutler at a hotel in Melbourne Beach. They were there to arrest her on a felony manslaughter charge. But according to authorities, when deputies moved in, Cutler pretended to be having a heart attack. She was taken for medical evaluation, cleared, and then booked into the Brevard County Jail. That moment drew major attention, not only because it was dramatic, but because of what it seemed to imply. At the point when she was supposed to face the consequences of what investigators said she had allowed to happen, authorities say she allegedly tried to delay the arrest by faking a medical emergency. Cutler was charged with felony manslaughter in connection with Jodi Cowan's death. A judge initially set bond at $250 dollars. Reporting later indicated that her release was blocked because of prior legal complications. She was also ordered not to own pets. Authorities also said Max and Mako would be euthanized. For the public, those developments answered some immediate questions. But they did not resolve the one hanging over the entire case. Why did it take a death for the situation to finally reach this point? That is the question that gives the story its staying power. Because this case taps into more than one fear at once. There is the fear of sudden violence in a place that feels safe. There is the fear of living near a danger others have already reported. And there is the fear of hearing that officials know a problem exists, yet the law still leaves them with limited power to stop it before someone dies. Jodi Cowan's death forced attention onto the gap between what neighbors experience and what authorities are legally able to do. Residents had seen the dogs. They had worried. They had made complaints. But worry, reports, and citations do not always translate into immediate removal. Sometimes the warning signs keep piling up quietly until the event everyone feared finally happens. And once that happens, every earlier detail takes on a different meaning. The broken fence matters more. The pacing along the fence line matters more. The prior roaming complaints matter more. The earlier citations matter more. The reported prior bite matters more. After a death, those details stop looking separate and start forming one fatal timeline. That is what gives this case its grim force. Not only the attack itself, but the normalization that came before it. Danger does not always arrive as one dramatic moment. Sometimes it settles into the background first. A dog gets loose, Someone complains. A citation is issued. A fence gets patched. Another report comes in. Neighbors say they do not feel safe. Life keeps moving because the worst has not happened yet.